As the year comes to an end, I have one question. Was 2024 a good year for VGC? We started the year off fresh with Regulation F, which was a continuation of Regulation E, only adding in the new DLC Pokemon. This, in my opinion, was a pretty tough format to follow up, as I do think Reg E was the best format we've had so far in Pokemon Scarlet and Violet. While the DLC did add quite a few new Pokemon, really the standout were the 6 new Paradox Beasts. Well, 4 I guess, since 2 of them really didn't do too much. Regulation F was really interesting though. It was a format that had a lot of really strong Pokemon and a lot of archetypes that did pretty damn well. The format started off with the Baltimore Regional Championships, where Power Knight plus Entei went on to win the event, followed up by the next weekend Wolf Glick winning the Orlando Regional with his hyper offense / balanced team built around the standard Firewater Grass Core of Urshi, Rilla and Incin, paired up of course with Fluttermane and some other strong attackers. Orlando was also our first look at the new Chi-Yu Glamora team that would really kind of take over for the format and be pretty consistent throughout. We also got to see some other archetypes as well that bounced up, things like Roaring Moon Balance and Iron Crown Sai Spam. We then saw a Roaring Moon Raging Bolt Balance team win the Melbourne Regional Championships. This was then followed up by arguably the most famous run of the season, that being Nikhil Reddy's Articuno team at Utrecht. But for me personally, the most memorable event of the year outside of the World Championships was the following regional, being the Vancouver Regional Championships. At Vancouver, we saw James Evans beat out Brady Smith in the finals using a Gouging Fire Howl team. But in Game 2, Brady Smith managed to pull off one of the best balanced plays I've ever seen. On turn 1, his Raging Bolt got dropped to 30 HP. Then, through the power of leftovers, grassy terrain, and double fake out from Incin and Rillaboom, he was able to bring it back to almost full HP to win Game 2. We then had Porygon 2 and Ursaluna winning EUIC. At the same event, Wolf Glick bubbled. He then takes that team the next weekend to the Orlando Regional Championships, where he goes on to win it. That same weekend, James Katz used the exact same team Wolf did to win the Perth Regional Championships. Then, to round out the season, a Cresselia Okie Dokie team won Sao Paulo, so yeah, that's kind of interesting. When you talk about Regulation F, the conversation always starts with Mr. Longneck, aka the Throat Goat, Raging Bolt. This Pokemon was without a doubt the biggest addition we had in the format. Its popularity is a big reason as to why Landorus Incarnate rose up in usage. Landorus Incarnate also being good opened the way for things like Archaludon Rain to be pretty solid in the format. But really for me, I think the biggest winners of the format were definitely the Raging Bolt Balance teams and the Ting Dozo teams that really kind of popped up towards the end of the format, where they basically just click Stealth Rocks, they click Yawn, and then they basically started spamming Fissure. And look, let's be honest, any format where Chi-Yu is good is a pretty good format. Heading into Regulation G, we had our first look at the 2 new restricted Pokemon, Koraidon and Miraidon. Now, early on, I think a lot of people thought Koraidon was the better Pokemon, had a lot more Pokemon that could abuse its weather, and overall was just a really strong Pokemon that could really abuse the Terra mechanic. Then we had Miraidon. This was a Pokemon that people were calling Mid-Rhydon, Fraud Rhydon. It honestly, on paper, didn't look that good. A lot of the Paradox Pokemon I wanted to play with weren't that very good. There weren't a lot of Pokemon really that enjoyed the electric terrain, and overall it just felt pretty bad. Also heading into the format, I think everyone looked at Calyrex Shadow Rider as, without a doubt, hands down the best Pokemon in the format. You have this incredibly fast Pokemon that's faster than everything, has one of the best, signature moves in the game in Astral Barrage, and honestly, the Pokemon was just really well positioned. Fast forward to our first regional championships, Calyrex Shadow Rider was basically nowhere to be seen in the top 16. Everyone was pretty prepared for it, and rightly so. And of course, none other than Mid-Rhydon kind of beat the allegations and went on to win the event. Now, I think one thing to keep in mind with Miraidon is, in a restricted format, this mon is incredibly good. I think early on, everyone was looking at its partners thinking, there really isn't that much that wants to play with it outside of like Iron Hands. But realistically, this is a Pokemon that doesn't need friends to be good. It is, without a doubt, one of the strongest individual Pokemon we've ever seen. Its damage output is honestly kind of crazy. But after the first regionals, it became the Zamazenta show. Marco DeBesti went on to win the Stockholm Regional Championships, putting on an absolute clinic and also showing off an iteration of what would eventually be his Worlds 2024 team that he used to get top 4 centered around Zamazenta. And then continued to get the top 2 placements at Santiago, but it was then at the Los Angeles Regional Championships where Calyrex Shadow Rider went on to win its first regional of the year. Lima was dominated by Terapagos in both the Calyrex forms, but then Bologna would be another win for the Calyrex Shadow Rider. But this event would also give us our first look at Luca Ceribelli's team that he would eventually go on to use to win the World Championships. Patrick Connors would take Calyrex Ice Rider to its first major win of the season, and at no better place than the North American International Championships. This was then followed up by the penultimate event of the season, of the year, the 2024 World Championships, when, as we said before, Luca Ceribelli went on to win it on the back of Mid-Rhydon, who is now arguably the best restricted in the format. In my opinion, this format was really interesting. We got to see the fall of Incineroar. It went from the best Pokemon in Regulation F, or at least one of the best, to really falling off a cliff, and its usage at the World Championships was the lowest I think it's ever been, at least since receiving Intimidate. We also got to see the rise of Iron Hands, partially because of Incin's drop off, but also because people just realized that Iron Hands on Rhydon teams was really good. It's an incredibly bulky Pokemon, it's Fake Out support, and it turns out Iron Feet is actually better than Iron Hands. Low Kick just deals so much damage to all the restricted Pokemon that it just really rose up in usage and was, at least in my opinion, the real standout of the World Championships. Now, while a few restricteds did have some pretty good results throughout the format, I do think this format was heavily dominated by 3 Pokemon in particular, that being the Miraidon forms and both Calyraxes. Now, Zamazenta and Terapagos also had some pretty good showings throughout the year, and Koraidon and Kyogre, while didn't win any events, were also really solid. But I do think this is where we had one of the biggest issues of the format, and that was simply in a single restricted format, it's just really hard to justify running certain Pokemon over, the big 3 or the big 5, however you want to look at it. Now, I will say there are 2 Pokemon that, at least in my opinion, are both really good that didn't see probably enough play, and that was Zacian and Groudon. Now, Zacian I think is a really good Pokemon that was probably just a little underexplored. I personally played it a lot before the World Championships, and I thought the mon was fantastic. And then there's Groudon. Now, Groudon's thing is, it's actually really good, I think. On paper, Groudon is exactly what you want. This is a format where you need a good ground type. Raging Bolt and Miraidon are everywhere. And Groudon is just honestly the perfect fit. It's incredibly good. It pairs really well with things like Flutter Mane and Chi-Yu Sun. But I do think its biggest issue is a lot of people just didn't want to click Precipice Blades at the World Championships. Now, in a double restricted where you can pair it up with something like, potentially a Xerneas in the future, maybe next year on Miraidon, people are probably going to be more likely to risk the Precipice Blades. But I think when you run, you're kind of putting your whole run on this one move hitting where it's only 85% accurate. Yeah, I think it's one of those things that players just don't want to risk it. But look, in Regulation G 2.0, I expect to see some more Groudon. Then we transition to the last format for the year, Regulation H. Now, look, honestly, a format where Chi-Yu is banned, it's just not a good format. But honestly, look, jokes aside, Regulation H was a breath of fresh air. In my opinion, Regulation H is what Regulation D should have been. For anyone who doesn't know, I guess, Regulation H was a format where every legendary Pokemon in the game was banned. It was just all the Pokemon, obtained legally through both DLCs and the base game. No legendaries, no Urshifus, no Ergoporns, no Tornaduses, Landorus, no restricteds, Miraidon, Cridon, they're all banned. Calyrax, ban them all. Yeah, it was a breath of fresh air. Then we started playing the format, and we started seeing things like Archaludon Range just absolutely dominating the early formats. Wins the first regional. Because of this, all of a sudden, we start seeing other weathers pick up. I believe we saw Gabe Agadi went on to win the Joinville Regional using snow. We then had Nils Dunlop winning his second event of the year using sand. It was just, a lot of pieces started rising up in usage to help, kind of counteract the Archaludon. And that's where we ended up getting, in my opinion, what was the defining Pokemon of the format, Sneasler. Sneasler went on to dominate this format for a couple reasons. One, it's incredibly quick, has some very good abilities, one of the best close combat users in the format, and of course its signature move, everyone's favorite, Dire Claw. You spin the lottery, you flip the coin, you pray you hit, pray you go to sleep, and yeah, it was pretty toxic to say the least. But as the format developed, we did actually see a few Sun teams do pretty good, thanks to Joseph Ugarte and Marco Silva, both having really, really strong results with Sun, and they were both using different versions of it. We had Joe Ugarte running his Typhlosion, Jumplup, Torkoal stuff, and then we also had Marco Silva who was running, his Trick Room stuff with Ursaluna and Charizard, which honestly was pretty damn good. As the format did develop though, we did see both Ursalunas become pretty good. The raw power coming out of Ursaluna Blood Moon was just insane. Blood Moon is just super good. Earth power in the format was also crazy. And Terra Ghost regular Ursaluna with Guts Flame Orb also was one of the best answers in the game to Sneasler. A lot of the time these Blood Moons were paired up with things like Talonflame HO, which most of the time consisted of things like Sneasler plus Indeedee, and we also saw the regular Ursaluna paired up with a lot of Porygon 2s, just being one of the most powerful Trick Room combos in the game. But then right towards the end of the format, we had what was potentially another meta-defining Pokemon, and that was Multiscale Dragonite. Now, this mon did kind of start picking up probably around halfway through the format. Multiscale gave us, a fantastic defensive answer, and with Scale Shot as well, one of the very few Pokemon that could KO Sneasler through its Focus Sash, which in this format was incredibly important. But you cannot talk about Regulation H without talking about the last event of the season. That being the Toronto Regional Championships, where None other than Wolf Glick went on to win his third regional of the year with the team that only he could pilot to a victory. A very interesting take on Rain in this format, which was his Polytoad Goth Perish Trap team, with Kingdra as the main Rain sweeper over things like Baskia Legion. Now, the thing to keep in mind with Wolf's team here is Rain has been good for the entire format. As I said, it won the very first regional of the season, of the series, sorry. And the thing was, a lot of those Rain teams were built around Pelipper, just, you know, strong Weather Ball, strong Hurricane, could be a Tailwind setter, a Wide Guard support if you needed it. Honestly, in the Terra format, Pelipper is just an incredibly good Pokemon. Archaludon is fantastic, and then Choice Banded, Baskia Legion, Mystic Water Life, or whatever you want in the Rain is just insane. Terra Water Wave Crash does way too much damage. Last Respects is one of the best cleanup moves in the game, and honestly, it's just been so good for so long. But Wolf brought just what was an incredibly interesting take on it, bringing in his Perish Trap team that only he could pilot, and honestly just had one of the best, you know, runs of the year. Regulation H, all in all, I think was a solid format, but I think towards the end, it really became a format that was just bullied by heavily statted Pokemon, and while that's not necessarily a bad thing, I do think the amount of Pokemon with big stats in this format was very limited, and that's why we got to see a lot of the, you know, the pseudo legends kind of just dominate the format, right? The Archaludons, Garchomp for a certain amount of time, Dragapult also early on was really good. Sneasel, while its stats aren't anything super insane, it is incredibly min-maxed, right? We also saw Dragonite towards the end of the format doing incredibly well. Both Ursaluna forms are just absolutely absurd when you look at their stats on paper. And because of that, I do think the end of the format definitely became a bit trickier to, you know, play for. It felt like you were a lot more limited in what you could do. Then, as I said, Wolf Glick comes out with an incredibly off-meta team with Polytoad, Gothitelle, and wins the whole thing. So, yeah, what do I know? Now, to round out this video, I want to talk about my players of the year. And there are three people in particular I want to talk about. Number one, Lucas Sarabelli here. Without a doubt, the biggest winner of the year. He won the 2024 World Championships. There's not really much else you need to say. That is the biggest event of the year. He is now a world champion. The other two players are, one, Wolf Glick. I think Wolf had what is probably the best run out of everyone in terms of consistency throughout the year. Wolf Glick this year was a 3-time regional champion, which is absolutely insane. To do it 3 times in 1 year is ridiculous, let alone just like 3 times at all. I think that's kind of insane. On top of that, he also had a historic day 1 at Worlds. Now, I didn't mention it when talking about the event earlier, but if you guys didn't see, Wolf Glick, I think he started off, I think he was like, was it 8-0? I think he was like 8-0, and his like record was 16-1, heading into like day 2. Unfortunately, his second half of day 2 was pretty sad. I think he ended up going on to like lose 2 or 3 straight games. But the run itself was absolutely insane. To go through like day 1, 7-0 with like a record of 14-0 was crazy. And then I think game 1 of day 2, he goes like, he 2-1s the guy and he's sitting at like 16-1, which honestly, absolutely insane. Shout out to Wolf Glick. He's the GOAT for a reason, the best player in the world. And yeah, he had a fantastic, fantastic way to close out the year. And then the other guy here as well, Patrick Connors, regional champion, NAIC champion. Not really much else you can say. The guy had an incredibly good year, winning 2 major events, one of them being the North American Internationals, which arguably is the second biggest event of the year. So yeah, massive shout out to him. Now, finally, the question I asked at the beginning of the video, was 2024 a good year for VGC? Ultimately, yes. I think this year was pretty good. I think the formats itself were pretty diverse, which is very, very nice. We had 3 very different formats. Regulation F was, you know, pretty powerful, but nothing crazy. Obviously, you head into Regulation G, single restricted. It's the first time we've really ever seen it for a prolonged period of time. And then, yeah, we go into Reg H, where they just say, hey, you know what? We're going to cut the power creep. You know, Urshi, who's kind of dominated the format for a year, he's getting cut. Ogerporn, who's been really good for 2 formats, is getting cut. Tornadus is getting cut. And yeah, ultimately, because of that, I think it was really, really good. And I will say, look, it was definitely fun going into a format at the end of the year without any legendary Pokemon. As I said earlier, I do think that's what Regulation D should have been. But regardless, we got it now, and honestly, I can't complain. If I was going to complain about any one thing, personally, it would be the length of the formats. Now, I know this is a pretty hot take because there are quite a few people who think our formats aren't long enough. You know, I've seen people say 4 months is too short. They wish it was 6 months. And I believe, you know, in terms of competitively, you know, if you want the best competitive matches, a longer format's better. It gives us a longer time to really kind of figure out the format and really kind of just, you know, figure everything out, you know, figure out what's really good and then, you know, figure out ways to beat it. But ultimately as well, I think for a more casual fan, I think the longer formats are worse. I think You know, you'll get people who might come back and play VGC for 2 to 4 weeks, and then they leave and come back for the new format. And because of that, I personally really enjoyed the 3-month format. I also think as a content creator as well, 3-month format was a bit easier. It was a bit more fresh, right? You know, you had that, 4 to 6 week period where everything was new and everything's fun, and then you have like another month or so where you kind of, it's still good, but the hype kind of dies down. And maybe for me as, someone who makes videos, that's kind of a big reason why I prefer the 3-month formats. But regardless, 3 to 4 months, I still think are really, really solid. And definitely one of the best ways to, run the year of VGC. But yeah, anyway, guys, we're going back to Regulation G, and the fish is back, baby!